So I'm going to read, first of all, an excerpt from my book, The Building Recovery, and we're going to talk about what is meant by that, try and expand it maybe a little bit. And this is really about, or asking the question, what is the medical model? So I start out this section with a quote from no less than Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest philosophers that we know of. And he said this, that all the insane be turned over to the philosophers, and that the medical men stop mixing into the business of the human mind. Now, I can't agree with that any more than I do, so I've quoted it in the book, and then I go on to say, for at least the last 150 years, our Western culture, at least, has been soaked, you could say saturated, in what I will call the medical model. This very powerful way of looking at things arose from the scientific approach. So you've got the scientific approach, then the medical approach is based on that, and then the psychiatric or psychological model is based on the medical model. This way of thinking about ourselves affects everything we do, especially the way we think about ourselves. Now, this is because this way of thinking has been largely accepted as the way to think about ourselves, not just one way. Now, you may be shocked, actually, to find out how much this view has influenced not only the way you manage yourself, particularly around difficulties, but the way the church itself has been influenced, and how much this view has got into maybe the church you attend. Now, it's incredibly influential, this view, this medical model, especially around our mental and emotional well-being. Thousands of books offer tempting straplines about how you can be a better you, stop being a failure, say goodbye to depression, etc., etc. It goes on and on and on. But what do most of these books have in common? Well, they're mostly based on the medical model. Maybe worst of all is that, like some other worldly things, it has got into the church. As a result, it's become mixed in with God's word and his teaching, and produced as much confusion amongst the suffering saved as it has the unsaved. The medical model benefits and limitations. At the time of writing, the world is dealing with a global pandemic around this coronavirus. We see photos of this virus on news feeds, and it's actually a perfect example of how useful the medical model can be. As a pathologizing model, it always starts with the question, what's wrong here? It helps us find cures and vaccines for things like the coronavirus. Now, this view makes sense at that point. Why? Because a virus can be seen under a microscope. But let me ask you seriously, can you see an attitude, a belief, or even a feeling under a microscope? Of course not. So that's where we start to get to the limits, or the limitations of the medical model. I'm borrowing here in a quote from the Anglican prayer book, The Morning Prayer, where it says, "There is no health in us." So we can start to see the limits of this medical model. The problem is that our society has become so saturated with this type of thinking that we're applying it to everything. How many times do you hear yourself and others say, "What's wrong with me?" And there's something wrong with you. Now, psychology based on the medical model attempts to discover the problem. It then quantifies, describes, diagnoses, prescribes, names and cures whatever symptoms we have. The act of looking for and differentiating between different patients' issues, because of course in this model you're a patient, it leads to an ever-growing number of conditions. The DSM-5 now includes enough diagnosable and nameable conditions that as early as 2014 it was said that more than 50% of Americans were included as suffering from one or another of the growing list of conditions. There's no doubt that's got worse since then, and there's coming a time when every single person on the planet could say that they have some kind of condition that's in that book. So how does the medical model work? Essentially, the medical model says you need to change, or in other words, you need to be less like you. When we're talking about mental or emotional issues, this is like telling a cheetah that it should have stripes rather than spots, often placing the patient in an impossible position because of the way it creates inner conflict or self-loathing. It often leaves people with a sense that they have to change, whilst at the same time defining a self-image that feels inadequate to the task. What a trap it is. Another section, changing your view of yourself. Now, the model you'll be using in this book is biblical and often says just the opposite of the medical model. In this book, you'll be learning why becoming more like you can be such an effective approach when attempting to outgrow your addictions or your dependencies. You'll also learn how the Bible has modeled this for us and offers us a God-given method. It's amazing to see actually how Jesus has literally modeled this and gives us this wonderful method of how to view ourselves in a very different way to the medical model. Now, of course, the reason the medical model has been so successful in defining the way we think about ourselves is that it often matches how we feel. You know, you do things wrong and that you fail, you have problems, you have terrible thoughts sometimes. The medical model echoes your experience by saying, yeah, that's because there's something wrong with you, and then offers you a way to fix yourself. This model and the approach it takes has produced a self-help industry that is set to be annually turning over $13.2 billion a year by 2022. Not to mention a medicinal pill industry, which is set to be turning over $1,033 billion annually by 2022. Now ask yourself something here. If these approaches were effective, surely they'd be levelling off now or even shrinking, right? What does it say about this approach that it's growing every year? What does it say when we realise that it's a business? And so if it's a business, then it's in its own interest to fail. Imagine a business where if it worked, it would shrink. And if it doesn't work, it grows. Well, that's the business we're talking about. Be prepared to be challenged. A lot of what you will learn in this book will go against your common sense. Most of all, be prepared to follow what God is saying through His design, through His Son, and through His Word. Let's build your recovery. Well, that's what I say in the book. Now, how can we sort of give you an idea here about, expand on the medical model, what it is? Well, as we know, the model says you need to be less like you, whereas I believe the Bible says you need to be more like you. You know, Psalm 139 verse 14 says that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. In other words, you're made in God's own image, from Genesis 1:27, right? And we know that's a complex thing. Isaiah 64 verses 7 to 8 tells us that we're just clay, really, but we're modelled by God. He's the potter and we're the clay. Now, even more on point, really, is Ephesians 2 verse 10, which tells us that we are God's masterpiece. Now, I know that's the ISV. Most other versions say that we're God's workmanship, but it's the same thing. God's workmanship is perfect. We're the pinnacle of His creation. We're His art. We're His masterpiece. Now, the problems start when you're told all these wonderful scriptures in church, but you start to feel worse, not better. Why is this? Because the medical model makes us one thing. It kind of says you're just one thing that needs treating. And you know, of course, your thoughts, you know your evil deeds, your evil ways, your attitudes are not perfect. And so you basically say, well, this can't be me then, because I'm not like that. I'm not perfect. I'm not wonderfully made. I'm just this evil person. I have terrible thoughts. My attitudes are not great. You see, but the Bible teaches you that you're complex, not just this one thing. You've got spirit and you've got flesh. Now, this is much more accurate. So you end up being disappointed, confused, hating yourself and not the sin. ashamed and shrinking, instead of praising God for his wonderful creation. You know, Galatians 5:17 says that your spirit and your flesh are in opposition to each other. This is natural. And so, because they're in opposition, you maybe not do what you want. Now, another version says you often find yourself unable to do what you want. And I love that word, because it describes exactly how the spirit and the flesh come in opposition to each other. Romans 6 verse 16 says it's which one we obey, that's the important thing, which constructs an even more complex self, actually, when you think about it. What does it say? It says that there's now a spirit going one way, there's your flesh, which is going another, and there's another part of you which gets to choose which of those two we follow. So you can start to see how the Bible is much more complex in its understanding of a human being. But what happens often in church? Well, we get preached about Romans 12 verse 2, about how to be transformed by the renewing of our mind. We've all heard sermons on that. But how many of us have heard sermons about exactly how to do it? Not so many hands go up then. The church basically demonizes while science pathologizes. And the result is the same. It basically constructs something to hate, something to fight, and it's something to get rid of, either by one means or another. And I'm not saying there's no such things as evil spirits. If you think you have an evil spirit, something that comes from outside of you, well, then get the elders in the church to pray for you. That's absolutely right. But once it's been removed, once it's been prayed for, what are you left with? You're left with you. And, 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, no temptation has overtaken you that isn't common to man. What does that mean? It means we've all got that. We've all got that. You're not suffering from anything unusual or anything that isn't something that we all suffer from. But it says God provides a way out. And I believe he has provided it, and he has modelled it. James 1:14 underlines this really when he says, but each person is tempted when what? They're enticed by their own evil desire. It's what's naturally inside you that's enticing you. And what I'm saying here is that if we follow a biblical approach that says this comes from within you, if it's part of you, then we need to change our whole approach to it. We need to think differently. Instead of hating ourselves for what is wrong with us and trying to change us, you'll find I use that word very little in my approach. What we need to be doing is doing what Jesus did with the disciples. He knew they were evil. He called them evil to their face. But did he hate them? Did he fight with them? No. He loved them. He taught them. He worked with them. And in this book, in this approach, you're going to learn how to work with yourself instead of working against yourself. And it causes what John 17 talks about as the harmonized self, the unity that Jesus is talking about.